Welcome to the fifth episode of the Doon School podcast. The story of the Doon School started with the story of one man's dream, which manifested into an institution which continues to be the leading light in the field of school education. Just like the masters who owned them, the few cars on campus had distinct personalities of their own. And this trend of masters' vehicles having personalities of their own continued even till 4 to 5 decades later. Who can forget Mr. Vohra's ageless Vespa scooter, Mr. Kunzru's black Fiat, or Dr. Bhatt's Lambretta scooter? But more on that in a later episode. Mr. Gibson's green Buick was famous for its journeys. He once took Miss Barrett to Chakrata and got stuck there for the night. But there was a more successful trip to Devprayag too. The Buick was also famous for another peculiarity. Its engine became so red hot that the red glow could be seen through the floorboards. When Mr. Barrett acquired a car, the weekly said that it had broken the record set by Mr. Martin's car. His could only come down a hill, but Mr. Barrett's could actually move. Then Mr. Martin bought a wonderful Chevrolet. He got it for only 750 rupees from a missionary who thought the world was about to come to an end. It was an excellent car except that the seating resembled a child's perambulator. In 1938, he exchanged it for a Ford V8 which nearly killed him and Mr. Gibson in Kulu when the steering jammed. Mr. Ashraf's car had its own share of adventure. In April 1937, Messrs. Bhai, Menon and Ashraf were stranded in the forest in Mr. Ashraf's car amidst prowling tigers. The weekly reported that the three musketeers were rescued by a Major Williams. The main event of the term was the pageant of the Doon, held on Founders' Day, which was presided over by Shri Jagdish Prasad. The visitors sat on the lawn north of the main building and the scenes emerged from behind a screen near chestnuts and proceeded in front of them. The main attractions were the elephants, camels and horses, but the costumes too were magnificent. Most of them had been procured by Sahibzada Saidu Zafar Khan, who was a very good friend of the school and provided a great deal of help in starting adult education classes for the servants. It was probably at the end of this term that Mr. Thomas wrote his classic report, which read, "Ranjit has been very sluggish throughout the term, but ended up by producing a good stool in the carpentry shop." Fortunately, Mr. Foote was able to intercept it. In the holidays, Mr. Gibson and Mr. Martin took some boys to ski at Gulmarg. When school opened in 1938, Mr. Barrett and Mr. Eric Sprossen had left, as had the dame of Tata House, Miss Russell. Mr. Foote took over Tata House. Other new masters were Messrs. Shanti Swarup Agarwal, B.C. Khanna, who was a Cambridge cricket blue, and Hunter Boyd. Mr. Hunter Boyd was a live wire and had a tremendous enthusiasm for farming in general and compost in particular. Mysterious flocks of sheep would appear on the main field and purchases of bullocks would be made for which there was no provision in the budget. One never knew which part of the estate would be ploughed up next. He got himself arrested once for carrying off by night what seemed to him a desirable pile of stones that lay in the Gurkha lines. The school never had a dull moment while he was there. It was in this spring term of 1938 that the school council was inaugurated. Mr. Martin wrote, "Its meetings have always been conducted with an amount of decorum and an absence of passion that distinguish it from other legislative bodies." In March occurred the exciting Civic Cat episode when Mr. Martin and Mr. Gibson were, according to weekly reporters, found firing guns at each other down opposite ends of the culvert in front of Kashmir House. There was a Civic Cat inside the culvert. Mr. Martin later said that he was quite clear in his mind that a warning was given before he fired. Miss Welby left in April and Lord Linlithgow visited school in May. In the summer holidays of 1938, Mr. Foote went on leave to England, Messrs. Ashraf and Clough to Persia, while Mr. Gibson and Mr. Martin went off to Kulu and over the Rohtang Pass onto Lahore. On the way back, while fooling around trying to glissade down some mud slope, Mr. Martin tore his thigh open on a rock, necessitating an operation in a forest bungalow. To further complicate the situation, the dispenser working the hand pump passed out long before Mr. Martin went under, and Mr. Gibson had to administer the anesthetic. Mr. Martin was still in the forest bungalow at the time of the Munich crisis of September 1938 and was in fact laid up till December. In October, Sir Harry Haig came to present the Tennis Cup, and in November, Sir Joseph Bohr presided over Founders' Day, at which a mushaira was staged. At the end of the term, Mr. Clough produced the Night of the Burning Pestle in the Assembly Hall, which in later years became Mr. Pandey's classroom. At long last, the new swimming bath was opened with Mr. Thomas in charge. The hospital was moved from the old hospital into its present quarters. There are two peculiar things about the health of the school in those early days. One is that scabies was quite common, and boys with scabies attended classes but had to sit at the back and wipe the table afterwards with disinfectant which they carried around in bottles. The other is that on 2 or 3 occasions, epidemics spread so quickly that boarding houses had to be turned into isolation wards. The first cross-country race took place in February 1939. The cross-country cup was presented by the housemasters. Mr. Thomas was the leading spirit and paved the way by organizing paper chases and games of hare and hounds. March saw the first match with HSN College played in Lahore. Prefects were evidently beginning to assert their authority by now, for a letter to the weekly said, "I should like to know what prefects are coming to. They seem to be becoming more important than some masters." About this time, the first holding house was opened with Mr. and Mrs. Clough in charge. It was sometime early in this term, on a free evening, that Mr. Martin wandered out to find a suitable site for something which was to become a very important feature of the campus. The open-air theatre, our beloved Rose Bowl. Where the Rose Bowl now stands was thick jungle, but below the thick jungle was the retaining wall around which the seats were eventually constructed. Work began with the voluntary labour of boys, but while it was going on, the labour quota system was organised. The person largely responsible for the design was Mr. Ayub Ahmed. Social service and dignity of labour have been an important part of the school ethos since its inception. Building a tank and starting a school at Tunwala village was already underway by now. It was in the summer of 1939 that on his way home, Mr. Martin had the most fascinating journey of his life. He travelled by ship from Karachi to Basra, from where he shared a bus with some Seventh-day Adventists to Ur of the Chaldees. Then he got a train to Baghdad, but in the early hours of the morning, an American lady woke him up because she thought he ought to see the Karbala. The Nain bus service then took him to Damascus, and an Arab taxi driver drove over Lebanon to Beirut. Thence a ship to Athens, and after due interval another one to Dubrovnik. Another interval and another ship to Venice. 4 months later, he arrived back in Bombay accompanied by Mr. Gibson on 1st of September 1939, the day Hitler attacked Poland. Mr. Gibson had been assured that the immediate consequence in India of a European war would be the immediate freezing of petrol supplies. So they drove Mr. Martin's prefect northwards to Dehradun in constant expectation of petrol supplies being suspended. Such was the spirit of these bold adventurers, which was imbibed in ample measure by their students.
The content of this podcast comprises history, anecdotes, and memories regarding the Doon School. The IPSS expressly disclaims any and all liability or responsibility for any direct, indirect, incidental, consequential, or other damages arising out of any individual's use of, reference to, reliance on, or inability to use this podcast or the information presented in this podcast.